interview hosted in the CoP interview series by the UN Women Training Center's Community of Practice, the CoP. My name is Ria Ligari. I'm the CoP and Virtual Dialogue Consultant for the UN Women Training Center, and I'm very lucky to be joined today by Otgonbaatar Tsedendemberel, who will be speaking to us today about promoting human rights and LGBT rights through training for gender equality in Mongolia. Before we begin, I should just explain that this CoP interview series features interviews with experts on topics related to training for gender equality. Interviews take place twice a month, and our series runs from June through to December 2017. So each interview lasts about half an hour, and all our listeners, have the chance to ask questions at any time. You can use the questions tab on the right side of the webinar platform, and feel free to send in your questions at any time, and we'll get to them at the end of the interview. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest for today. Otgonbaatar is the former executive director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Center of Mongolia, the LGBT Center, and he has helped lead the country's LGBT rights movement and advocated for LGBT rights internationally and domestically. He's been actively involved in many pressing issues like HIV/AIDS and sexual and reproductive health rights, and he's also worked for the Mongolian Red Cross Society and the International Committee on the Red Cross. And he's also been an instructor at the Educational Advising and Research Center, working with Mongolian students who aspire to study abroad. And currently, Otgo is a member of the Program Advisory Committee of the Asia Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, ARROW, and he's also a board member of the Mongolian organizations Open Society Forum and Youth Policy Watch. So it's wonderful to have you here today. Otgo, how are you?
Good, how are you? Thank you very much for inviting me to your series. Just a very quick clarification. I've stepped down as a board member of Open Society Forum and Youth Policy Watch as of August this year, as I'm away from the country. And at the moment, I'm doing my gender studies master's degree at Central European University.
In Budapest?
In Budapest.
In Budapest. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. Well, it's lovely to speak to you, and it's our great pleasure to have you here with us today. And so I guess we'll get right to the questions. And before we talk about different works of your different aspects of your work as an activist, I wonder if we could discuss a bit more about your personal experience of training for gender equality. So specifically, we'd like to know a bit about how you came to be a human rights activist and specifically a gender trainer, and what prompted your interest in advocating for LGBT rights in Mongolia.
Mm-hmm. So sure. I mean, before I give it to you, my personal experience, I would like to give a little bit of background information, how I became a gender trainer, or let's say the activist in human rights and LGBT rights. I came back to Mongolia in 2006 after 7 years of living in Japan. So I did my law degree at the University of Tokyo and went back home in 2006 and found out that there was a very poor representation of the LGBT community in Mongolian, social and political, economic, or any, lives. So as our former LGBT Center's executive director, Robin, says all the time, it was the right time, right people in the right place. That's how it happened, that we really, founded our organization, LGBT Center, in 2007, although we had a little bit of struggle. But it was really because of our collaboration with strong Mongolian feminists, women rights organizations. By building our allies, we had to work together and organized our workshop generally, with the themes of gender equality, discrimination, and specifically about LGBT rights. Mongolia has a very dynamic, vibrant civil society. As you all know, we came out of the socialist regime from very strong influence from Russian-influenced doctrine and ideology in the 90s. So Mongolia, we had 1997 NGO law, which permit NGOs to be established, to operate its activities. And our National Human Rights Commission was established in 2001, and National Committee on Gender Equality in 2007. So civil society is very strong, especially organized by our veteran and experienced feminists and women's rights activists. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, personally it's political. I'm a gay man and I studied abroad and I came back home supposedly I should be, really sharing whatever I learned abroad with our fellow country citizens. But at that moment in 2006, the timing was amazing with all the great activists around, and it was the right moment to do it. So I would say the social injustice, inequality around me motivated to be really strongly spoken about our rights. On top of that, my mom is a very strong woman. Even at the age of 75 now, she's a political party sub-district women's committee leader. So she said that this summer, last year, a younger woman actually challenged her, how come you are the leader of this women's committee while having a gay son? Because I appear on TV a lot and I spoke, and I had a picture with my mom on Facebook, so she saw that. But she answered that, by having a son who's gay doesn't have anything to do with me. So if you're competent enough to have this job, please go ahead. So, because of this, very strong social activism in my family, I'm also motivated to speak up, not only for LGBT rights, equality, inclusion, but also gender equality and for all the social injustice that I see around me.
Wonderful. That's very inspiring, I think. And in terms of becoming a gender trainer, did you receive formal training, or did you decide to study gender equality, or how did you come to be? Because training for gender equality is quite a niche, I guess, subdivision of this. So how did you come to this particular field?
So I talked about specifically our feminist and women's rights organizations. Here I would like to mention the Feminist National Network, which is a nationwide network. And from the name of it, it's a feminist organization and its former coordinator. And I saw that she will be speaking in the middle of October next month on the women's training, Ondaria. That organization really revamped its mission, vision in 2006 to be all-inclusive of the marginalized groups. So we would get together and, work on ideas, and especially she's taken the leading role. We can training, especially the regional learning community. I've been involved from the beginning of it, throughout its process until the manual was finalized. So that itself actually kind of developed me from LGBT rights activist into more proper gender trainer, although I haven't been through this very, a strict theoretical training of the whole subject matter. So Ondria, for example, during our national training would say, I'm actually trying to give you the PhD level concepts and ideas in a very easy, comprehensible manner. So that's how we really start, trainers of trainers workshops and workshops on masculinities, transform masculinities towards gender justice. And all these things, I think, eventually prepared me systematically, but I'm really here at the Central European University to get it under my belt. So from the theoretical perspectives.
I think that's excellent. I think field work is just as important, really, as academic study. And I think, like, the experience you've had as in these training of trainers workshops, I think must be very beneficial and very grounding in how to approach these gender training. And I wonder, because you mentioned a little bit before that when you moved back from Japan to Mongolia, the social injustice that you perceived there. And I wonder if you could tell our listeners maybe a little bit about what challenges the LGBT community in Mongolia currently faces. For example, I read one of your interviews where you mentioned challenges like familial and social pressures and threats from ultranationalists and a lack of knowledge on sexual orientation and gender identity, and even sort of state of lawlessness, a lack of legal protection. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the challenges as you see them.
Yep, of course. Look, I mean, it's been a little bit more than 25 years since we, transitioned to a democratic process. but it's still the majority of our public sees homosexuality or LGBT rights issues in general as a Western import. I mean, this is something that we did not have during the socialist era, but all of a sudden, because of globalization, because of our opening our country to the outside world, all of these, ideas are coming without any filter. So these, the so-called taboo issues, which were during the socialist era, nowadays we're discussing gender, sexuality, LGBT rights, and so on and so forth. Still, people are quite allergic to hearing this. So that could be one of the issues we're dealing with currently. So the committee members, from the freedom of expression, I hear and I read news that these days transgender girls are being beaten up in the street in Mongolia because, usually people say, we understand you, we admit that you are gay or lesbian or transgender, but do not flaunt your sexuality or do not show yourself because you are giving a very negative, bad examples for the young generation. So families and usually parents would be taking a very defensive role of their kids when it comes to LGBT rights issues. On the other hand, family and social pressures, I see a lot of my fellow gay men or lesbians, just because of family pressure, they're marrying, people of their opposite sex, people they do not even attracted just to satisfy their families, demanding that they need children or they need, families and so on. On the other hand, the freedom of assembly. I mean, Mongolia has made tremendous progress ever since the LGBT Center was established. I mean, thanks to a great collaboration and our persistent activists' work. But we still cannot really organize our pride on the main square of our city. This year, Mongolia celebrated its 5th Pride event. It's called Equality Walk and Pride event. So the metropolitan municipality doesn't even give a permission to walk across the square. I mean, it will be a political statement that LGBT community themselves are really talking about their struggles and realities and promoting their rights on the main square, but they still don't allow it to happen. So that is the biggest barrier in terms of freedom of assembly. I mean, the biggest barrier would be the lack of knowledge or very substantive information on these progressive laws and policies the government adopted on the side of the government officials. We recently adopted our criminal code, a revised criminal code, which actually prohibit the sexual orientation, gender identity related discrimination. We criminalize hate crimes. But so far, I mean, the law enforcement officers and those people who supposedly be working in this field have insufficient knowledge on this. So we have a long way to go, considering this current situation.
Yes, I agree, but I think the progress sounds very impressive in such a short period of time because I believe that the center was only set up in 2009, I think.
2007, we were founded, and then we struggled 3 years to get officially registered because the authorities did not want to register us because they said that the name itself is foreign and it has a very, it would set wrong example for the youth and adolescents in the future. Yeah, but we managed to get registered and we have all these laws being amended. Recently, the labor law, the LGBT Center submitted its own comments. But I mean, law itself being adopted is one thing and implementation is another thing. But you're right, within a short period of time, we've made a lot of progress and it actually empowers and inspires not only the community members, but also activists and our allies and other gender training professionals, experts, yes.
I think that's wonderful. It's very inspiring. And I wonder, you spoke a little bit about this, but I wonder why you feel training for gender equality is important for addressing these challenges that you've spoken about. I guess especially in terms of awareness raising and promoting human rights and LGBT rights. But, how do you think that training can help us address the issues that the LGBT community in Mongolia is facing?
I would like to talk, about my own personal experience back in 2009 and 2010 when I organized LGBT rights workshops.
Please.
When I start talking about the LGBT rights, I mean, even the terminologies themselves are foreign words. It's transliterated in our language. I
Mhm.
mean, only intersex has its Mongolian version. All the other versions are either derogatory or translated, but which would really take some time for us to explain. So it did not really resonate, it doesn't really go to the ears of the listeners, when we talked about LGBT rights, where it is coming from. It's all like, human rights discourse, etc. So when we started working with our women's rights organizations through, working together to have our trainings, it really changed the game because we talked about the power imbalance, why, the marginalized groups are, suffering or being marginalized in our society, or why they're in unequal distribution, or, do people have equal starting points? So when we really talked about it from the intersectionality lenses, from all these frameworks, it became very clear, not only for us as trainers, but also for the audience to understand why we need to pay for these issues around the LGBT community members. So that itself was a great way for us to explore the issues now 7 years ago. And another thing is the solidarity and movement building. It really brought together all the I guess, disadvantaged or marginalized groups under one umbrella. So we would be good friends with our disability activists, or activists working on ethnic minorities, or those, advocating the other minorities and the people, victims, of the human rights violations. So we became together. So through these trainings, I think Mongolian civil society, especially the rights-based organizations, movement became much stronger. And our solidarity is stronger than ever.
That's excellent. And I think that's a very important topic that you
Mm,
raised, this idea of intersectional,
mm,
looking at power imbalances from an intersectional lens
mm,
and building solidarity on
mm,
what we have in common and also what we have
mm,
that differentiates us. I think, and also you
mm,
spoke a little bit then about, the kind of activists who are engaged in training for different
mm.
areas. But I wonder which stakeholders you feel are very important to engage in training, perhaps as participants. Like you mentioned before, law enforcement, for example, may not, even though there are very progressive laws now coming into play, perhaps they're not implemented because there's a lack of knowledge on behalf of law enforcement or on behalf of government officials who perhaps are not familiar with these laws or not familiar how to implement them. So who exactly have you targeted with the LGBT Center, and also in general, who do you feel should be targeted with this kind of training?
Come to us with their rights violations or whatever happened to them. It will be either police brutality or some cases which did not go uninvestigated, which we actually included in our UPR report, which gave us a very strong recommendations to push our government even further. So police and law enforcement, agencies were the first and foremost important stakeholders. On the other hand, psychologists, the psychiatric counselors, we had amazing American counselor, scholar, and she came and gave these professionals training to how to work on LGBT rights issues. Another thing, journalists, because back in 2000, early 2000, basically, the news coverage, media coverage were very inflammatory and only sensation-oriented news about LGBT rights. We were just, the perverts who like sex, nothing else. So it was very important to engage the journalists to really discuss how we're going to write about these issues. So we used the GLAD manual for journalists. So now this year, LGBT Center is going to organize training for rural medical professionals when it comes to the transgender sexual health issues. and transitioning, hormone treatment, reassignment surgery, and general sexual and reproductive health of the LGBT rights communities, we definitely need to focus on this area. Another area, when I did my human rights masters in Thailand, I focused on the topic of the critical role of the working group to amend the Mongolian criminal law. So during this research, I found out that politicians, especially parliament members, they really wanted to learn or know about these issues, but they were just too shy to ask about it. So very pro-human rights parliament members would tell me that after certain parliament discussions, they would just, ask her, can you explain to us what this is all about? Should we support this issue or not? So these were very important revelations during my studies. So I think in the future also we have to focus on the politicians and especially those who are eager to learn, but a little bit, afraid because of their political career and status.
I agree. I think but these are very important spectrums that you've covered. The media and politics and law enforcement. These are really, I guess, the pinnacles, especially when violations are forthcoming and support is maybe they're a bit shy to support the issue. So I guess to encourage us, it's very important. And turning to something, because I think this is very good and very positive. And I wonder if ever, when delivering training or when advocating for rights, as you mentioned, that it took 3 years to get the center registered with the authorities. So I wonder, either when you're delivering training or when you're advocating, how do you overcome resistances to either to LGBT rights or even just to the idea of human rights encompassing the rights of all human beings to live, as they choose and to live without fear and without discrimination. So I wonder, how do you deal with resistances to this?
Yes, definitely. As I mentioned, there are all kinds of resistance based either on social and cultural norms, traditions and customs. Mongolia is a very traditionally patriarchal, with very strong masculinity roles in our society. So definitely the resistance comes, especially when it comes to LGBT rights. We discuss human rights, and as I said, for some people, they just receive it so badly. It's almost very allergic to their ears. And after 25 years of, democratization process, now I think we are moving to more internalizing these international ideas. I mean, we are the country which ratified all international human rights, mostly all, human rights documents, treaties, conventions, but we haven't really thought about it carefully, what it really means for us, what kind of cultural legacy or our own legacy in terms of religion, in terms of people's philosophy, everyday living, how does it really, play a role or manifest itself. So I've been looking at the ways that our trainers are dealing with it is basically human rights ideas interlinked with human dignity. And if we approach from the human dignities, we could actually fend off this resistance. Not just, in terms of confronting or counter-arguing their points, but also trying to reach a common ground, because we had these, concepts and ideas in our culture before the socialist, regime. For example, the Buddhist Mongolia is of Tibetan Buddhist culture, and then shamanism, for example, accepts the two-spiritedness. Or as I said, that we had our Mongolian word for intersex.
Yes.
What does it really mean? Or in the 1930s, in our literature, we had certain characters talking about the homosexual behavior. So these kind of internalizing international ideas on the ground and how our culture or mindset inherently were quite tolerant and accepting, that would actually kind of help us. And that is how we are approaching in last few years. Also, when we talk about gender equality issues, there was emerging resistance from men's organizations. Men's organizations, not necessarily men's rights organizations, but men's organizations which had some little bit legacy from the socialist era, that they were discussing that men are suffering too. So what should we do? So these kind of issues, again, we have to look at then how we are going to achieve the common goal, despite us being men or women or LGBT or transgender. Another resistance would be the funding. Because our LGBT center is, funded by the external international donors, and most of our programs and other small grants would be supported by the embassies in Mongolia, especially U.S. Embassy, Australian Embassy, and EU. The resistance immediately questioned that, are you promoting the agenda from the West? So basically, these are the resistance. I think in the development process, it is a natural phase that we have to go through, but one at a time, we're resolving, we're trying to find out that very feasible solution. I mean, we're at the end of the day saying people, even if they resist, there might be reasons. So we just want to find out what kind of reasons they have, even though the resistance come from fellow NGOs or government or from other people. So that is how we've been dealing with them.
That's an excellent approach, I think. I really like especially the idea that you said about contextualization and, appealing to the values that we all have in common, how values of human dignity and values of, of cultural legacy of people being different and that not being a bad thing. And I think this is also very important, as you say, that we have to really understand where the resistances are coming from, why are they appearing, in order to, overcome them. And I think that's maybe maybe we can discuss a little bit about, this is a very broad question, so I apologize in advance.
Yeah.
If we have a bit of a, maybe you could tell us a bit of a motivational story that you've had in one of your training experiences. For example, either where you or a participant has, you've experienced change or you've witnessed change in someone else or in yourself through a training session.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to take you to like one of our workshops, for example, like how it happens, like masculinity, sexuality, gender equality, with all these sessions. Some of the workshops can be like 5 day long. So we would be outside of the city, staying there, and really discuss these issues day and night with some activities in between, which are quite fun, even including salsa, dancing at night and so on. So, during these workshops, we really share our intimate stories. We see people shedding tears, or talking about some really big issues that they have in their childhood, but now finally able to come up with it. So the training process itself actually empowers and liberates and really allow us to let out. I remember a lot of times that we would be just, hearing very America, or I lived there, so I understand. So you should be able to teach this topic to our officers. So when it comes to the, grassroots level police officers, those who are really working with us, they would be the ones who would be struggling to understand this, right? So when we organize this police officers workshop and training, I mean, after a few years, I would see some of them, and then they wouldn't really speak in front of their, senior officers with me, because it would be misconstrued by like, oh, you're gay, or you're talking to that gay man. But they would come to me, secretly, or write me a message saying, you were great, thank you very much, and it really changed my view on the community. And as you introduced me as a translator, working on the humanitarian issues, I'm still working on working with some organizations translating. So during the workshop organized by FPI, I also worked with the police officers. So some of them recognized me and came to me and shook hands without even be worried that other officers might make fun of them and so on. So that itself was amazing. That's how those police officers themselves emotionally matured, over the years. Obviously, it will take some time. And another great story, on the bus from our capital city, Ulaanbaatar, to another city, the bus stopped during a break, and two guys came to me and said that they attended one of the training, we organized. And then, they were a little bit shy, but during the break, they had the moment to talk to me, and they really saying that we're behind you. We may look in our middle-aged and, not really typical, gender-sensitive people, but we are really there behind you. So please keep in mind. So these ordinary people, either they're police officers or strangers on the bus, they just really come because it's really the smallness of our country, because, we're only 3 million on that large territory, especially in our capital city, only over 1 million like me and a public figure. Sometimes I get to enjoy this feedback from the public in a great way.
I think that's fantastic, and this is very inspiring. This and very motivational. I think this idea that people really do internalize and transform their own views, and then by that extension, their actions. I mean, if they would have felt reticent about, greeting a person who they know to be gay and their superiors know to be homosexual, and they now they do want to shake hands, and they don't feel this prejudice, and they don't feel that they need to adhere to others' prejudice.
Exactly.
I think that's it's a wonderful story. And we have one last question, which is from one of our listeners called Adeke, and she wanted to know what other approaches do you think, aside from training, can help bring greater change in people's mentality and attitudes towards LGBT communities in Mongolia?
So in Mongolia, I mean, we just talked about this very conventional or some approaches we have come up so far. I think in the future, we really have to adopt more innovative or creative ways of dealing with our audience, through arts, through talk shows, through basically kind of a workshop engaging us in different activities. So that would be really, important initiative, instead of just us informing about gender, equality issues or LGBT rights for the audience. We could, discuss certain issues. I mean, panelists are nowadays a very popular form that, a lot of experts and people with resource information would argue on certain topics. That also works very well, but we also have to deal with the criticism coming from the general public that what is all this talking should entail in the end. So engaging public in a more creative way that they would be also interested in would be best way, I think.
I think that's a very inspiring and very good message, and an excellent message, I think, to end on. And I just want to thank you so much for being with us today. And I think this has been such a lovely, wonderful interview, and it's really enriched our COP interview series, and it's been a great, great pleasure. And I want to just assure everyone who's listening now live that this recording will be available on the UN Women Training Center's YouTube channel, and I'll also post it on the COP platform. And of course, I'll send you a link, Otgo, and so I hope that many other people will listen to it, the ones who weren't able to attend live, and because I think there's a lot to learn and a lot to discuss on this. And I like the point very much about being more creative in how we engage everyone in this discussion. Well, thank you so much, Otgo, and I wish all of you a wonderful
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Good day.